Welcome to bass bit number 11. We're still talking about seconds. Major seconds and minor seconds are really fun material for scales. So we've already looked at the scale that is made up out of exclusively half steps, which is the chromatic scale. We've also looked at the scale that is made up out of exclusively whole steps, which is the whole tone scale. Today we're going to talk about a scale that is a combination of whole steps and half steps, and there are two. Now, with these symmetric scales, there's a sequence that always repeats. So there is not the concept of having a leading tone and a beginning and an end like you would have on a regular major scale or minor scale or any of the modes, all of which we'll get to. But one of the fun things about these symmetric scales is that they are, even though they are sonically a bit more complex, they are really accessible on the fretboard because it's a repeating pattern. And once you understand how to move it up and down, there's a lot of stuff you can do with them. Out of the combination of whole steps and half steps, we can build either a scale that starts with a half step, then is followed by a whole, half whole, half whole, half whole, and so forth. Or we can build a scale that starts with a whole step, whole, half whole, half whole, half whole, half. In the book, I am on page 29, where both of these scales are explained. And I want to play you the 3 diminished scales in the fingering as it's shown in the book. Now, what's really interesting about these diminished scales is, as I said, they don't really have a beginning and an end. They are symmetric in nature, so they have actually more than one beginning. What I mean by that is that, for example, the E diminished scale also contains the notes of the G diminished scale, the B flat diminished scale, and the C sharp or D flat diminished scale. If I start with a whole step, this is called a diminished scale. This has to do with the sounds that it describes, the sort of chord changes that you will be playing this with. If I started with a half step, it's called a diminished dominant scale, also because of the tonal material that you can be using this with. I want to start out with the diminished scale, and that is also the whole half-tone scale, and you will see it described on page 30. And as with the symmetric scales, the sequences repeat. So I don't have 12 chromatic scales. It's basically one chromatic scale, right? Because each and every note could be the starting point. This is similar with the diminished scale also, because the notes that are, for example, in the E diminished scale are the same notes that are in the G diminished scale, in the B flat diminished scale, or in the D flat diminished scale. It's just that when I call it the D flat diminished scale, I'm starting on D flat, but I use the exact same sequence as I would be on the E, G, or B flat ones. So as you notice, they're all a certain interval apart, and we will be talking about that interval very soon. It's a minor third. Well, what's relevant here is that they contain the exact same notes. So I want to just play through one of the examples on page 30, which would be the E diminished scale or G, B flat, D flat diminished scales. So I'm starting with an open string, so that gives me a whole step right there in the beginning. But then I have this shape of half step, whole step, half step, and then I'm going to the next string. So I have my whole step in between these two. And I encourage you to really think through, why is the E diminished scale the same thing as the G, B flat, and D flat diminished scale? How does that work? With the diminished scales, we have 3. So each diminished scale basically covers 4 roots, if you will. And the roots, again, are only relevant because of what the chord symbol will say. And the way these scales are built, I don't get a sense of a beginning and an ending. They are always the same pattern, following the same pattern, and they don't sound like your regular major scale, which, for example, clearly has a root, right? So with the diminished scales, that's different. But that said, they create great tonal material, create great variation, and I want to show you a little bit how to use them. There's 2 ways of playing them. You can either play the next note and then scoot. So whole step, and then you have play the next note, then scoot. Going here, the next note, then scoot, or you can scoot right away. Backwards, descending, same idea. You scoot first or you scoot later. Or so those two options are, I think, good fingering. So I want to play you the scale that is written out on page 30. This is a scale that does not start with an open string, so it's a little bit different. The chord that you would be playing this scale over is a diminished chord. It sounds like this. Okay, we'll talk about what that chord is, where it comes from, what it consists of, and all that good stuff. But for you right now, maybe useful to know that any diminished 7 chord will be a great backdrop to use those scales over. So if you have iReal Pro or something, plug in a diminished 7, DIM7 chord. That's what you want it to say. Not -7 flat 5 or not half diminished, fully diminished 7. And then you can use that over that backdrop. And I, as always, love using my delay pedal. And so forth. So that'll give you some ideas to make some music with a diminished scale. Great, fair to know, great to really go up and down the fretboard and sort of get familiar with how the fretboard works. Again, we're fingering major seconds and minor seconds, and we're making music with that. All right, have fun.